and get started. So, as best I recall, we are in 2 Kings chapter 2 tonight. We have seen Elijah taken up into heaven, or we're about to, I guess, at the beginning of chapter 2. Elisha is going to take his place as God's spokesman to the nation of Israel. And so they go, the two of them go together from Gilgal. Elijah tries repeatedly to get Elisha to stay behind. Elisha is dedicated, determined to go with him everywhere he goes. If you'll notice, beginning in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah tries to get Elisha first to stay at Gilgal. Not going to do it, so they go down to Bethel. Let me get another one here. Here we go. They go down to Bethel, and notice at verse 3, some of the prophets from Bethel come out to Elisha. Do you know that your master is going to be taken away today? Yes, I know. Keep quiet. That is, I know what's going on. I'm aware of this. So next, stay here at Bethel. I've got to go to Jericho. No, I'm as the Lord lives, I will not leave you. So off they go to Jericho, and the sons of the prophets at Jericho. What's their message to Elisha? Your master is going to be taken away today. And then stay here. I've got to go to the Jordan. No, I'm going with you. And notice 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went. They didn't go immediately with them, but they stood a distance off. And here it is that Elijah and Elisha cross over from west to east. They're actually heading back in the general direction of Elijah's home. Think about it now. Put a little map up here. Those of you online probably can't see this too well, but Tishbe, where Elijah is from, is right here. Jericho, where they have been, Gilgal and Jericho are right here. So it's some distance north, roughly speaking about 20 miles north, but across the Jericho is just a couple of miles, across the Jordan from Jericho is just a couple of miles. So they cross the Jericho, they're in the general vicinity, the east side of Jericho, where Elijah would have grown up. So he's not far from home when God takes him. The 50 sons of the prophets are within sight of them. And as they cross the river, as they're going to cross the river, Elijah takes his mantle, rolls it up, and strikes the water. And the water parts, shades of Moses, except instead of millions of people, it's just the two of them. They cross over. And now the request. What do you want from me, Elisha? Why have you stuck with me all this time so diligently? I want a firstborn's share of your spirit. I want a double portion of your spirit, and that's the share that a firstborn would receive. According to the biblical principle of primogeniture in the Old Testament, if a man has 5 sons, when he dies, his estate will be divided into 6 parts, and the firstborn gets a double share, and then each successive son gets 1 share. Elisha is asking for a double share of Elijah's spirit. We sometimes read this, a double portion, as if he's saying, I want twice as much as you've had. And that's not the implication here. A double portion, a firstborn share. Now, bear in mind that we think of firstborn as order of birth, and normally it is. Obviously, Elisha is not Elijah's son, so he has no claim on that basis. But just as Reuben, Simeon, and Levi in succession were disinherited, not from being heirs of Jacob, but from being the firstborn, the next generational patriarch, so that Judah would become the firstborn. So it could be with each generation, with each family, that one who is not literally the first in order of birth might become the firstborn. Think about David's heir as king of Judah, king of Israel. Solomon, far from being the oldest son, appears to be the youngest child in David's household, the youngest son at any rate. And yet, who has David tapped by inspiration to succeed him? Solomon. So here, Elisha is asking, if you offer me, this is what I would like, to be your heir, to be your successor in this role. So if you see me taken up, then you'll receive what you've requested. You asked a hard thing. Well, how is that a hard thing?
Maybe he knows what will come with it.
He may well know what will come with it. You think about, we look at this from Elisha's point of view, and what has Elisha seen Elijah do? Elisha is aware that Elijah has called down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice at Mount Carmel, and he's been vindicated over the false prophets. And he prayed, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years, and he prayed again, and it rained abundantly, and so forth. What has Elisha not seen, at least not up close and personal?
Elijah in the cave.
Exactly. He has not seen Elijah in the pit of despair, so to speak, going from the mountaintop to the valley of death, so to speak, running, fleeing for his life from Jezebel. He's not seen Elijah so despondent, so discouraged, that his prayer to God is, kill me now, take me out of here. And as I forget, that may have been Mike Richardson pointed out a week or two ago, the irony here is that when God sends Elijah back from Mount Horeb, go anoint Hazael, go anoint Jehu, go anoint Elisha, and then you get to go home. In a sense, God is answering that request. So it may have been a rather sobering thing for Elijah to confront his mortality in this way. You ask for it, you're going to get it. Oh, be careful what you pray for. All right, what would you have? I'd like to be your heir. This is a hard thing. What does Elisha perhaps foresee for Elijah? Elijah for Elisha. I reversed the names there. Sorry about that.
I mean, he did have to speak to the people of Israel, and it was just full of nonsense. So
okay,
a lot of responsibility.
Okay, Cherie says he knew that Elisha would be dealing with the people of Israel, and they're full of a bunch of nonsense, to use a highly technical term. Well, that's true, but think about this also: who had been the primary ruler of Israel during much of Elijah's prophetic work? Ahab. And what do we know about Ahab?
His wife is in charge.
Okay, good way to put it. His wife Jezebel is in charge. She is in many ways the power behind the throne. And the thing that we know about Ahab is that he provoked the Lord more than any other king before him. And that includes Jeroboam, that set up the false religion in the first place in the northern kingdom. But who's going to follow Ahab? Well, his son Ahaziah. And who's going to follow Ahaziah? Jehoram. And who's going to follow Jehoram? Jehu, who will wipe out Ahab's lineage. And after Jehu, then we have just a succession of ungodly men. And some of them just bang, 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 bang in rapid fire order. A month here, 6 months there. Elisha is going to deal with some rulers in Israel who seem to make it their goal to surpass Ahab for wickedness. None of them are going to have much of an opportunity in a lot of respects. but Elisha is going to have a lot to deal with. So Elijah says, you've asked for a hard thing. And it may be too, that as Elijah says that, his words may also have the flavor of, well, it's really not mine to give. That's up to God. But here's the sign. If you see me as I'm taken up, then you'll receive what you've asked. So as they go along, they talk. Chariots of fire, horses of fire separated the two of them. Elijah goes up in a whirlwind. Elisha saw it. My father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen, and he saw him no more. What's the significance of the chariots of Israel and the horsemen? Chariots of fire, if you remember that 1980s movie about the 1924 Olympics. What's the significance of this figure of chariots of fire and the horsemen thereof?
This Bible has an interesting note. It says Elijah, not Ahab's armies, had been the defender of Israel.
Okay,
So
number one, and that's true in a sense. Elijah, rather than Ahab's armies, had been the defense of Israel in the conflicts during Ahab's period. Ahab and his planning and his scheming had not been of any avail. It had been the power of God that had preserved them in spite of Ahab. But this imagery of the chariots of Israel, in a manner of speaking, Elijah is being taken up as a king in power, in a manner that is befitting to a king, a manner honorable. Think about King Saul. Now, King Saul, obviously, when he dies, the Spirit of God is not with him. But where is he at the time of his death? He's out on the battlefield. He's been out in his chariot and so forth, rather than on foot. Various others ride rather than walk. So he's taken up in a manner that marks him out as someone exceptional. Think also, how many prophets are taken directly up into heaven? Or directly into, if not into heaven, directly into the next life without having to go through the process of death.
Was he in the chariot? I've heard this discussed.
Was he in the chariot? I don't know. I don't know.
Because all of the children's pictures show him in the chariot.
Yes.
And I had someone point out, oh, but it doesn't say he was in the chariot. The chariot just separated them.
Yep.
And he went up in the whirlwind.
That's true.
So
The text does not say he rode in the chariot, but he was certainly accompanied by it. Well, think about this. Who else leaves the world in this way? Go back into the book of Genesis, and you have mention of who?
Enoch.
You don't have any reference to Enoch and the chariots of Israel, but Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, it says. He did not suffer death in the conventional sense as we understand it. Who else? I can think of one other.
Jesus.
Jesus, that's right. Now, Jesus suffered death for all of us. But you go to Acts chapter 1, Jesus is taken up directly in the clouds. No chariots of fire, but he's taken up into the presence of the Father. That marks this out as an extraordinary, unusual circumstance. Why? Why did God take Elijah in this fashion?
To honor him.
Okay, Jim O'Brien says perhaps to honor him. And that would be a reasonable supposition.
It shows his presence.
Okay, it certainly shows the presence of God, no question there. It marks Elijah out as, beyond a doubt, God's man in this.
Power.
Demonstrates the power of God.
And with all the other prophets who knew he was going to be taken away. And then the
Oh, Jesus.
Okay, there's a point there. The 50 sons of the prophets that have accompanied Elijah and Elisha down to the river, basically, seemingly standing on one side while Elijah and Elisha are on the other. If they're still even within sight of this, it certainly demonstrates to them both Elijah's position, and as Elisha comes back, it would seem to imply, okay, here's the next man that you're to honor and to follow.
Wouldn't it also have given Elisha more backbone that he saw what God was doing for his mentor?
Okay, that may be a point to take as well. As Jim points out, this may be a way of God putting some steel in Elisha's spine, seeing that God is with him.
Mhm.
The short answer as to why this way is, I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm not aware of any passage that says, here's why God did this for Elijah. The fact of it is recorded, and then we move on with Elisha. The interesting thing here is that Elisha's response is to tear his own clothes, a mark of mourning that would be readily recognized among the other sons of the prophets, among all of the Jews. And then as he goes back to the Jordan to cross back over, headed west to where the others are waiting, he takes Elijah's cloak that has been left behind, slaps the water with it, and look at the way he speaks. Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Now that's not a challenge to God. Rather, that is a statement here in 2 Kings 10 and verse 11, that or verse 14 rather, that basically says, all right, if I am Elijah's successor, show me. And immediately the water parts and Elisha goes over. So the first miracle that Elisha performs is identical to the last miracle that Elijah worked or performed. And notice in verse 15, the sons of the prophets, the others, the men who have followed them from Jericho, they acknowledge Elisha as basically as their new leader, or as God's primary spokesman appointed by the Lord. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho saw him opposite them. They said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they came to him and bowed to the ground before him. They acknowledged him as their leader. Their bowing down to him is in submission, in homage to him. It is not worship of him. So pick up then at verse 16, and verses 16, 17, and 18. These guys, they're fearful that somehow Elijah's body is left behind, as in a normal death. They're concerned that God has taken Elijah's spirit and left his body behind, left his body somewhere out there in the hills, as it were, or somewhere out in the plains to the east of Jordan, that it would be mauled by carrion and whatnot, that it would be taken and mistreated in some way. So they want to go. They want to search for Elijah's body. Now, what has Elisha seen? Elisha has seen God take him up. What became of Elijah's body? I don't know. God, that's probably the simplest way to describe it. God took care of it. Whatever Elijah needed, God provided. Whatever Elijah didn't need, God took care of, as far as that's concerned. Now, here's an interesting, just a little something to play with. Jump over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 for a moment. And what do we read about the resurrection? Paul writing about the resurrection from the dead. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul tells us, he says in verse 35, some will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. What you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he's chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. Now, he goes on and talks about being planted or sown, a natural body, being raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's a spiritual body. But what else do we find? You turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And what does Paul there tell us about the resurrection? The dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive, who remain, shall be caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so, adverb of manner, so shall we ever be with the Lord.
We'll be changed.
We will be changed in a moment, the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump.
Same body.
But though it's not the same body, there is a body. Think about this. What does Paul write to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 about the current right now at the right hand of the Father condition of Jesus? Yep. 1 Timothy, if memory serves me, 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let me double check that. I may be referencing 2 Timothy.
Worship and prayer.
No, hold on a minute. Let me make sure I haven't given you the wrong reference. Well, it appears that I have.
Pertaining to a body.
No, it's pertaining to Christ as the mediator.
Oh,
First Timothy 5 or 2:5.
Chapter 2 and verse 5. Okay, I looked past it and didn't see it. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. There is what? One God, one mediator between man and God. And then what does it say? The man, Christ Jesus. Or some translations say himself, man, Christ Jesus. The implication of what the Apostle Paul writes there about the current condition of Jesus is what?
He's in heaven.
Okay, he's in heaven.
At the right
He's
hand of
alive.
God, on
He's at the right hand of
of
the Father.
He's viewed as man.
Do what?
He's viewed as man.
He is viewed as man. He remains man.
Yeah.
His body is changed, yes, but he remains man. Why is that important?
So he can be a mediator.
Exactly, so that he can continue to be a mediator between man and God. In order to be a mediator, he has to be equally related, or in other words, equally disinterested, as we would say, between both parties to the dispute. The dispute is sin. The parties are God versus us. And who stands between us? Jesus Christ himself, man, God in the flesh. So, there is a resurrection body, some sort of non-ethereal existence. What are the details of it? I don't know. It's different. But when God takes Elijah up, what does Elisha see going up? Elisha sees chariots of Israel, the horsemen, fiery chariots, and Elijah, the man, being lifted up. The sons of the prophets want to go hunt for Elijah's body. The reasonable, understandable assumption is, well, God took him, therefore he's dead as far as this world is concerned. Certainly he is. Did God leave his body behind? Well, look at Elisha's response. Please let them go and seek your master. The Spirit of the Lord caught him and threw him on some mountain or in some valley. Don't waste your time, Elisha says. And they begged. For 3 days, they go and they look. They begged until he was ashamed, and he let them go. They hunt for 3 days. They find nothing. We assume sometimes from reading this, God took Elijah directly into his presence, and yet, where do we find everyone else who has died? In paradise, in Hades. Is there any reason for us to suppose that Elijah is not there with Moses and Abraham and Isaac and so forth, Samuel? In fact, if you turn to Matthew chapter 17, I would suggest to you there's every reason for us to assume that he is there, because on the Mount of Transfiguration, who do we find there with Jesus? Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, representative of the prophets. There's no reason for us to suppose that they came from two different places, one from paradise and the other from the presence of the Father himself. But regardless, we're getting off track here, and that's my fault. So they hunt for 3 days. They find nothing. Didn't I tell you? You'd be wasting your time. Don't go. All right. So they go down to Jericho. And what do we find? Well, bad water. Is that really a surprise? It shouldn't be, should it? What is Jericho?
He destroyed it. God, he destroyed it. He said he didn't want it to be rebuilt.
Exactly. When Joshua leads the people from Gilgal through the plains of Gilgal to Jericho, that's the first city in the promised land. And what's the instruction that God gives? It belongs to me. It's dedicated. It's consecrated. You kill everybody there except Rahab and her family. You obliterate all the livestock. You don't take any spoils. Everything that is of value belongs to me. Gold, silver, brass, iron, so on and so forth. Of course, we know about Achan and his foolishness. And then Joshua places that location under a curse. Cursed be the one who rebuilds this city. In the death of his firstborn, he'll build the walls. In the death of his youngest, he'll raise up the gates. Well, guess what has just recently happened?
Someone is trying to rebuild it.
Hiel the Bethelite, in the days of King Ahab, has rebuilt the city of Jericho. And sure enough, he lost his firstborn in the raising of the walls, and he lost his youngest in the building of the erection or the hanging of the gates. So it's an area that had been under a curse for hundreds of years, 500 and some odd years, basically, at this point. Is it any wonder that the water there is bad? Look at what it says down here at verse 19. Behold, the situation of this city is pleasant. In other words, it's a pretty sight. It overlooks the Jordan River. It's not far. It's down the plains. But the water is bad. The land is unfruitful. All right, bring me a new bowl. Put salt in it. Elisha makes the water at Jericho whole. Good land with bad water is still bad. Good land, think about where this is. This is in the promised land. What's the characteristic of the promised land? Land flowing with milk and honey. This is bad land because of bad water. What's the significance of salt? Salt is a preservative. Salt is a purative. Not only does it season, but it also preserves and purifies. So Elisha puts salt in the water source, and the water is made well, and that's a great blessing for all of these people. Look down to verses 21 and 22. He went to the spring, threw the salt in it. Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From now on, neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it. And the water has been healed to this day. It wasn't something Elisha did, something God did through him.
I think that's proven though, when you take salt, you don't put salt in water to make it good. You don't put salt in the ground to make it good. So you're taking something that doesn't make sense. And that
Exactly.
way it goes back to God. I'm gonna put fertilizer or a filter on this water, then you praise the fertilizer or the filter, but you put salt on it.
Exactly.
It can't be, right? And
You would think that this is counterintuitive. You put something in the water that would normally make it unpalatable. Anybody ever accidentally swallow a mouthful of seawater? Ah! But here, we're using the very thing that we would normally try to avoid in this kind of circumstance, to purify, to cleanse, and to make it palatable. And then we
So
have,
does this
go ahead,
remove the curse from the city?
I beg your pardon?
Does this remove the curse from Jericho?
Does this remove the curse from the city as a whole? The curse itself has been fulfilled in that Hiel has lost his two sons. That does not imply then that the city itself lies under a curse from this point forward, but rather the one who would dare to rebuild the city was cursed, not the city itself. And Hiel received his curse from the Lord. Well, look down at verses 23 through 25, and here is one of the most vivid, picturesque, in a sense, events of this period and in the life of Elisha, as Elisha is going from Jericho to Bethel. He's headed south, going from basically the heartland of the land of promise. He's going to Bethel, going south toward Bethel. And as he's going, he's passing through a fairly heavily populated area. This is part of the territory of Ephraim and Benjamin and Judah and so forth, headed down towards Simeon. Small boys or young men, depends on the translation you're reading from, come out of the city and they jeer at him. Go up, you bald head. Go up. Go up, you bald head. Now, if these are innocent little boys, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, what are they doing? They're taunting, mocking.
Repeating their parents,
I beg your pardon?
repeating their parents.
Repeating their parents, imitating their elders' feelings. They're repeating what they've heard. If these are not little boys, but young men, teenagers, maybe up to early adulthood, what are they doing? Even so, they're perhaps repeating what they've heard, and they are old
Mocking God.
to know better than what they're doing. They're mocking when they shouldn't have. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, sorry. They're just mocking God.
Okay, good point. In mocking God's servant, who are they ultimately mocking? The one he serves, God Almighty. And so look at the response. Elisha turns around, turns back. When he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. We look at this, and here come she-bears and tear 42 of them, injure, perhaps kill 42 of them. So we're not talking about just 2 or 3, we're talking about a whole crowd. And we look at this, and what do we see?
Poor little boy.
Yeah, looking at this from the worldly 21st century perspective, first thing we see is all those poor innocent little boys. Then we see what a bitter, hateful, cranky old man of God can't take a little teasing and things of this sort. In fact, go back and read carefully. Elisha curses them in the name of the Lord. That is, by the authority of the, he's doing what the Lord commanded him to do. He's not just reacting badly in his own right. He's doing what God commanded him to do, God is demonstrating his wrath on those who scorn his servants, even if it's just with words. And whether they're little boys, children, or as we would describe them, young men, there is no injustice in this. Think about this. If these are young men, older teens up to maybe 20, 21 years old, then we're talking about individuals who are old enough to be responsible and accountable for their own actions, aren't we? And they've brought this on themselves. But what if they're little children, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old? And the she-bears injure 42 of them. If they're killed, think about this. Has God not, in a sense, been a blessing to them? Because if that's what they're learning, to be disrespectful of God and his servants, God has taken them out of that environment before they've had a chance to get old enough and mature enough to be accountable for their own sins. 2 she-bears came out of the woods, tore 42 of the boys, and from there he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So Elisha basically makes a big circle, a big circuit down through the territory, basically of Judah, and then back up through the western territories of Israel, all the way to Mount Carmel, the site of Elijah's great demonstration, and then back to where? Well, back to the capital, to Samaria. So come into chapter 3 then, and now we find a change in the rulership. In the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 12 years. Now, at this point, we need to be aware that Israelite northern kingdom history and Judahite southern kingdom history can be a little bit confusing, because Jehoram becomes the king of Israel, son of Ahab becomes the king of Israel. But guess what? After Jehoshaphat, who is Jehoshaphat's son in Judah? Jehoram, the king of Judah. And these are two different individuals. They're going to reign at the same time, briefly. Now, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, is also known as Joram, Joram, and it may be easier to keep them straight in your mind if you think of him as Joram, and the one in Judah, in Jerusalem, as Jehoram. May simplify things, but through this period of these next 50 or so years, from Ahab down to the dissolution of Israel, we're going to find both several kings and a couple of prophets who share the same name. And so it's helpful to try to keep straight who's who in this circumstance. Okay. So come into chapter 3. Jehoram or Joram becomes king in Samaria, reigns 12 years. He's just like his father. Well, sir, as Gomer Pyle would say, surprise, surprise, surprise. Who's his mother? Jezebel. No wonder he's a wretched, sorry, evil, mean, nasty man. He's just like his father. He did put away the pillar of Baal. He improved marginally, but not much. He clung to the sins of Jeroboam, made Israel to sin. So he's not as devoted to his mother's idolatry as Ahab had been. But wait, what had Ahab done before he died? Ahab had humbled himself in the sight of the Lord in the years leading up to his death. God had oppressed him so severely that he backed off before he died. I don't entertain any illusions that he died in a righteous relationship with God, but he did back off, seemingly trying to provoke God, going out of his way to find ways to provoke God. And so Joram at this point is, he's not by any stretch of the imagination good or righteous or godly, but maybe he doesn't smell quite as bad, as it were, as his father had at some point. So he walks in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. All right. We begin here with Joram's rule. And the first thing to note is that false worship in this circumstance is just as offensive as false gods. He hasn't materially improved anything, has he? He's not as stinky with idolatry as Ahab and Jezebel had been, but he has not improved his standing with God. You pick up at verse 4 now and go down through verse 27, and here is a joint campaign proposed and carried out against Moab. Verses 4 through 8, you have the planning of the campaign. Mesha, the king of Moab, was a sheep breeder. He was under the oppression or under tribute to the king of Israel. That is, Ahab had put him to tribute. He was supposed to deliver 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. And as soon as Ahab dies, what does he do? He throws off the traces. He throws off the fetters, as it were, and he's not going to do that anymore. What do you think about that? That's a lot of livestock, a lot of wool production. That's a heavy toll on him. So what does Joram do? Well, I'm going to muster all of Israel, and I'm going to put down this rebellion. We're not going to stand for this. We're going to keep them in subjection. And for additional assistance, to whom does he turn? Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. Why would Joram, the idol-worshiping king of Israel, turn to Jehoshaphat, nominally the faithful king of Judah, for assistance?
Jehoshaphat was friends with his dad, Ahab.
Okay.
They had done an alliance or something.
Number one, they are related. They're all part of Israel. Number two, there had been affinity, friendship between Jehoshaphat and Ahab. God scolds Jehoshaphat about that. Number three, we're going to see there's more than just friendship. There are going to be family ties between them, which is just plain foolish. And number four, because of the friendly relations, Joram has no reason to believe that Jehoshaphat wouldn't support him. And lo and behold, he does. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? I will go. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. Which way shall we go? By the wilderness of Edom. So basically, Jehoshaphat says, I'll put my army at your disposal. Let's think about this for a minute. The last time Jehoshaphat went to war with an Israelite army, Ahab was king. And he goes and meets with Ahab, and Ahab has his 400 prophets. Shall we go to war? Oh, yes, 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 absolutely. The Lord is with you. And what does Jehoshaphat do? Well, isn't there a prophet of the Lord? There's one, but I can't stand him. He never says anything good about me. That's Micaiah. And what does Micaiah say? Not going to turn out good for you if you go. How does it turn out? Leads to Ahab's death. It really doesn't turn out good. They're defeated. Jehoshaphat, for all of the good that he does, shows himself in several instances to be less than fully dedicated, doesn't he? There is almost something of the spirit of Saul in him, it seems. So I'll put my army at your disposal. Go back to that incident with Micaiah. What was the complaint that God brought against Jehoshaphat there? Do you remember? You're making affinity with the house of Ahab, with idolaters and so on and so forth. But beyond that, you're trusting in your own military might, not in me. What's Jehoshaphat doing here? Well, sure, Joram, I'll put my army at your disposal. My army. Again, he's not trusting in the power of God. So they go, and they go a roundabout way, 7 days. Edom is conscripted into this, traveling through Edomite territory does what with this big army? Well, that's going to keep them in subjection as well. That's going to make sure that they're on the right side of things. And they're not going to seize this as an opportunity to rebel. And guess what happens? This is not good. This is not a good situation for them. Look down here. Is there no prophet of the Lord by whom we may inquire? Well, Elisha, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah. Jehoshaphat says the word of the Lord is with him. So they go down. What do I have to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. Why would I talk to you, Joram? You don't worship the God that I serve. Why would you come to me? Look at his response. This is interesting on one level, but it's so typical of human behavior on another level. The king of Israel, this is verse 13, says, no, it is the Lord who has called these three kings to give them into the hand of Moab. And Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, were it not that I have regard for Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would neither look at you nor see you. I wouldn't even pay any attention to you if it weren't for Jehoshaphat. Now let's think about Joram's attitude here. Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. Oh, no. I'm coming to you. What is he, number one, nominally admitting? Joram.
His prophets aren't powerful.
Okay, number one, the prophets of his father and his mother, the prophets of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the prophets of the Baalim and the Asherah of Jezebel, they're nothing. They're a bunch of fakes and frauds. Number two, what else do we see in Joram here? He knows who the real God is. And just like so many people today, when he wants something from God, he's very willing to acknowledge God, but only when he wants something from God, not the rest of the time. Well, if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even bother to see you. Bring me a musician. The musician played. The hand of the Lord came upon him. Thus says the Lord, I'll make this dry stream bed full of pools. Thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind or rain, but that stream bed shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, you, your livestock, your animals. This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He'll also give the Moabites into your hand. You shall attack every fortified city, every choice city, fell every good tree, stop up all springs of water, ruin every good piece of land with stones. The next morning, about the time of offering the sacrifice, behold, water came from the direction of Edom till all the country was filled with water. So Elisha has shown how offended he is by Joram's conduct and attitude. And then he says, all right, here's what to do. Why did he call for a musician? Beats me.
And he still could just pray.
Yeah, there's no explanation given. We could speculate, music hath charms to soothe the savage breast and all that sort of thing. The Bible doesn't say that that's what it is. But what does he say? The river, this dry stream bed, will flow with water. It will happen without you seeing or hearing rainstorms that will provide it. It's upriver, upstream. This is a trivial thing. It's a light thing with the Lord. And that's not enough. That's no challenge for him. He'll also deliver the Moabites, and God shows his acceptance of the morning offering by fulfilling his words. Now think about this. What should that have said? What should Joram have learned from this event? We haven't even gotten to battle with the Moabites yet. God's prophecy has been fulfilled. The land is full of water. And that's just a little piddly thing in God's eyes, as it were. He should have been hugely impressed. Well, now get down here to verse 21. And
I'm sorry, especially that the water in the valley shows up with no rain, right?
yeah,
If I know a storm front's coming, I can say, hey, the streets are gonna get wet, and you're gonna be impressed by this, and it rained, but he tells them there's no wind, no rain.
okay.
This water is gonna show up, like that should be even.
He also told them to do something. He said, fill the valley with ditches, make ditches in the valley.
Yeah,
And so evidently they were to dig these ditches, and what they probably thought, why in the world are we digging these
Yeah.
ditches?
plan this out, prepare this.
It's funny, you see all this stuff and they talk about, if I raise somebody from the dead, what signs, but then I would believe, who Christ is, I would believe these things. These signs, it's the same thing, just a different generation, even today.
Yeah,
Signs
That's
make no
us
difference.
baby though, like we see everything.
you're right. That's us every day. We see what God does and just sort of take it in stride. Your point, Mike, a minute ago, when we see dark clouds in the southwest, what do we instinctively understand? Pavement's going to get wet. It's fixing to rain. But here, they don't see the clouds. They don't hear the thunder. They don't even smell the rain. This is a long way off. It's upstream from where they are. Now, if you've ever lived on the plains, you understand how this can happen. There can be rain completely miles away out of sight. And then the flash floods come down the canyons and the ravines, and you'd better get out of the way because the water's going to rise fast. Well, that's what happens here. And so Joram should have sat up and taken notice. Well, 21 to 23, the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. All who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and drawn up at the border. And the Moabites, when the sun rose, they saw the water opposite them, red as blood. Well, the soil in that area is red, like the sands of Oklahoma or like the clay of Georgia. So the early red look of the sun on the reddish water looks like blood to them. Moab comes in disarray. They're not disciplined. They're easy to defeat. And guess what? They're defeated. They came to the camp of Israel. The Israelites rose and struck the Moabites till they fled before them. They went forward, striking the Moabites as they went. So they chased them, overthrew the cities, spoiled the cities, stopped up the springs of. Think about this. What instructions had Elisha given them from the Lord? Look back there to verse 19. Attack every fortified city, every choice city. Cut down every good tree. Stop up all the springs. Ruin every good piece of land with stones. That's total warfare, isn't it? That's driving the people out of the land. That's making it uninhabitable for them. Why would they cut down good trees?
Be able to eat fruit if it's a fruit bearing.
Okay, if it's a fruit-bearing tree, not going to be any more fruit from that tree. If it's a tree that could be used for timber, you're not going to build anything out of that. What happens in a wooded area when you cut down all the trees? What happens to the land?
Water comes, it forces that land to move.
Okay. Number one, you have problems with erosion. Number two, the land tends to dry out much, much quicker because now you don't have the trees holding in the moisture. Number three, if the vegetation begins to regrow, think about a clear-cut pasture or a clear-cut piece of timberland here in Georgia. After it's been clear-cut and the trees begin to grow back, what grows back?
Scrub.
Scrub, trash, junk. And it's hard to cultivate that land. So they're despoiling the land here so that the Moabites can't use it. The Moabites try to escape. They're unable to. Now, they're supposed to ruin the fields. When Israel first marched into Canaan under the leadership of General Joshua, what were they supposed to do to the fields in those days? And fruit trees and so on. God said, I'll give you fields that you didn't plant, vineyards that you didn't tend, and you'll eat of fruit trees that you have not tended. They were supposed to spare all of those things, but that's in the promised land, and that's territory that they're going to be inhabiting. They're going to live in houses they didn't build, in cities that they didn't organize, and so forth. But this is Moab. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20 for just a moment and look at verses 19 and 20. In Deuteronomy, Moses is giving the conquest generation their marching orders. He is renewing the law, the covenant with them, and giving them their instructions. And you start at verse 19. When you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human that they should be besieged by you? Only the trees that you know are not trees for food you may destroy and cut down, that you may build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it falls. But that's where? That's in taking over the promised land. This is in defeating the Moabites who are across the Jordan River. Now look down here to verse 27. And the king here, the king of Moab, saw that the battle was going against him, verse 26, tries to break through against the king of Edom, 700 swordsmen, they can't do it. And how does he respond? His desperation is so intense. He sacrifices the crown prince, his firstborn child. That's desperation. Notice, he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, offered him for a burnt offering on the wall, and there came great wrath against Israel, great indignation, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Why was there indignation? Why was there wrath against Israel? Well, yeah, basically they have pushed him to this point of human sacrifice. Who's the indignation Who is indignant or who is angry against them?
I don't know, but Moab's god was Chemosh, who they offered child
Yeah.
sacrifice. That was a normal thing to offer to their god.
Moab's god was Chemosh.
Yeah.
Human sacrifice was part of their religion. So from their perspective, this is not too far out of the ordinary, but this is the crown prince. That's an act of desperation.
Is it like a rally cry, like you pushed us to make the ultimate, they're gonna do everything they can. It reminds me like you're trying to rally the troops by doing something. Is that what the sacrifice is?
In a manner of speaking, I think you're correct. It's an act of desperation, trying to rally his troops, trying to bring his God in on their side. And of course, there's no God to bring in. Chemosh is a figment of their imagination. So there's no power there.
In their mind, their god would be mad at them. That the reason they're having this battle and the reason they're losing is because their god is mad. That's the way these people reason with it.
What about
Either-
the son being the king,
So-
with the son that they sacrificed? What about them being upset because that was their next king?
Okay, there's part of this as well. In sacrificing the crown prince, in effect, he is cutting off the next generation. This is the last desperate act, you might say. But look at the circumstances. Why is the indignation directed against Israel? We're not told. We might speculate. Indignation among themselves, among the Israelites themselves. We have pushed them to this point. You would think, though, that if that were the case, if it was the Israelites that are so offended by this, it would push them to fight harder in order to punish an act like that. Maybe it is the case, speculating, of course, that this act causes the Moabites to fight even more desperately to the point that the Israelites, the Edomites said, we're done with these people. It's not explained in detail here. We could speculate all the rest of the evening, but they withdrew, returned to their own land. Now, if they've cut down usable trees and they've basically salted the fields with rocks and what have you, they have sufficiently impoverished Moab for the time being that Moab's not going to be a problem, at least for a little while. Their primary challenge, at least over the short term, is just going to be to survive. So they're no threat at this point. Now, the corollary to that is that this is from the standpoint of Joram, who has had them under his thumb, inherited as a tributary or vassal kingdom from Ahab's day. This is kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face, because if you have ruined their ability to produce herds and flocks and pay tribute, well, guess what you're not going to get? You're not going to get any taxes paid to you, are you? Because they can't give you what they haven't got, can they? So it's sort of a moot point there in a sense, but they have in one sense been punished. Question: why would God allow Israel and Judah and the Edomites to have success against the Moabites when Israel and Edom are, boy, they are absolutely nothing to brag about as far as faithfulness and submission to God, and even Judah under Jehoshaphat is boy, way less than an upstanding kingdom in a lot of ways. Why would God be on their side?
His name, they were still his people.
Still his people, for his name's sake.
And then Elisha said because of Jehoshaphat.
God has some respect, some reverence. Not, it's the wrong word. because Jehoshaphat is not as bad as he might have been, basically.
Maybe it's looking at it the other way. The Moabites were so bad that God was paying retribution to them
Okay,
because of their child sacrifice.
remember the Moabites in the days of Moses. They had come out armed against the Israelites. And God had pronounced judgment against them. Furthermore, they're not just idolatrous, they're offering human sacrifices to their false gods. So they have nothing to recommend them, no virtue on which to stand. There is a point to consider, or just sort of file away in connection with this. We see God using Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser and Sennacherib and Shalmaneser to punish Israel in the image of Assyria. Now that's going to come a little bit later, when Israel goes into captivity to the Assyrians. And then about 150 years later, we see God raising up Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to conquer and punish Judah for their sins. And in both cases, what's God doing? He's using unrighteous, idol-worshiping people to punish whom? Unrighteous, idol-worshiping people who happen to be his people and should know better. Well, let's think about it from that standpoint for a minute. What is God doing here? God is using unrighteous, idol-worshiping people, Israel and Moab, along with Judah, who are not exactly prize winners for their perfection, to do what? Punish ungodly, unrighteous, human sacrifice, baby offering idol worshipers for their sins. God does not focus only on his own people. God does not ignore sin and unrighteousness in the world at large. His laws, his values, his standards, his principles apply everywhere in the world, not just where people honor him. And the fact that billions upon billions of people in the modern world ignore him, dishonor him, deny him, defy him, that doesn't change the fact that he is fully in charge and working his will in the world even today.
Regardless of the side that he's on, he'll be the victor.
That's right. Regardless of whose side he's on, he is the victor. Good point. Well, jump down into chapter 4 now, and here we retreat from the battlefield, as it were, to a much more personal series of incidents in the life of Elisha. The wife of one of the sons of the prophets cries out to him, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, but a creditor has come. You know, he was a good man, but a creditor has come, and he's going to take my sons to be his slaves." Well, what do you want me to do about that? What shall I do for you? What do you have in your house? I have nothing but a jar of oil. All right. Go borrow every container you can find, basically. Every pot, every bottle, every jar, every empty vessel you can lay your hands on. Borrow not a few. And then you go in and shut the door, just you and your sons, and you pour oil. You start pouring. And when one vessel is full, move to the next one. Set that one aside, move to the next one. Fill that one, move to the next one. Fill that one, move to the next one. Well, she does as she is told. When the vessels are full, bring me another. We're out of empty containers, Mama. And the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, okay, go sell the oil. Pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. All right. A private miracle, not a public one. What's the key to the miracle?
Her action, her obedience.
Obedience. She did what she was told. She didn't object. She didn't quarrel. She didn't say, but. She acted in faith. The debts are paid and a living is secured. That particular son of the prophet didn't have any insurance except in God. And God came through for him in spite of that.
Does it seem like she's saying in verse 1 that Elisha knew her husband personally?
Presumably so. There's no reason for us to assume that this would not be one of the company of prophets, perhaps that were located in the vicinity of Jericho or what have you. Remember that Elisha makes the rounds, as it were. He knows these people, and they have acknowledged him as their nominal leader. So
Maybe he was one that Jezebel killed.
could have been one of those that Jezebel had killed. I hadn't thought about that. So now Elisha goes on to Shunem. Shunem, little town up here. And there's a wealthy woman there. And so she feeds him as he passes by. Her kindness is extended to him, verses 8 and 9, before she ever knows who he is. Whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat. She urged him to eat some food. Whenever he passed that way, he would stop there. She said to her husband, "Behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let's make a small room on the roof with walls, put him a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp, so whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. Let's build him a spare room, more accommodations." And you look at verses 11 through 17, and you see that not only Elisha, but God approves of this good woman. Go call this Shunammite, Gehazi. You've done all this for me. You've taken all this trouble for me. From her perspective, she's a wealthy woman. It didn't cost her much. It wasn't a big imposition. What would you have me do for you? You want me to speak to the king or speak to the commander of the army, the high ranking? Is there some favor I can do for you? That's a pretty big offer. You know, if you go speak to President Biden on behalf of somebody, he really doesn't have it within his purview to waive their taxes, for example, because of our form of government. But you know, in a kingdom, in a monarchy, whose word is law? The king. And the commander of the army, the Secretary of Defense, basically, he's a pretty high-ranking guy. He's got some pull. He's got some clout. Would you like me to speak to the king? Maybe I could get your taxes abated or something like that. Maybe I can have him do something for you. You know, if you have a high income, king needs money. Who's he coming to first? He's coming after you because you can spare it. I dwell among my own people. She basically says, I don't need anything. I'm good as I am. Well, what is to be done for her? And isn't it interesting? It's Gehazi. It's the servant who says she has no son. She has no heir. Her husband is old. She is facing the prospect of aged widowhood without anybody to take care of her. Well, we would look at that and say, yeah, but her husband's wealthy. She's pretty well set. Except what's going to happen when the husband dies? The nearest kinsman is liable to redeem the estate. And she's basically out of luck unless he's a kindly fellow that maybe gives her a little something to live on. All right. Here's what the Lord will do for you. This is unsolicited. At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. Oh, no, my Lord, don't lie to me. And guess what? Next year, she has a bouncing baby boy. And as he grows, he goes out with his father among the servants, among the reapers, and suffers something. Is it sunstroke, heat stroke, an aneurysm, a seizure? I don't know. Something happened. The Lord's answer to what can I give you had been to give her what in that day, in that time, in that culture would have been her greatest possible joy, a son. And then the boy dies. And she goes to the only one who can help her. Look at verses 22 through 24. The approach to him. Send one of the servants, one of the donkeys, that I may go quickly to the man of God and come back again. Why will you go to him today? It's neither new moon nor Sabbath. All is well. Hurry, hurry, hurry. She goes to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So he's not even there. It's a good little distance from Shunem to Mount Carmel. He's the only one who can help her as far as she's concerned. Hey, Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite woman. Wonder what she wants. Go find out what she wants. Is everything okay? Is all well with you and your husband? Is all well with the child? And look at her response. It is well. All is well. Why would she say that? Her son has died. She's in bitter distress. That figure of speech, it is well, all is well, the Hebrew is shalom. It's peace. Why would she respond that way? Well, number one, she's coming to the man of God, the one man that she knows who perhaps can help her. But number two, that response, shalom, speaks of spiritual and physical well-being, but it's also used as kind of a non-committal response in Hebrew. Kind of a,
I'm fine.
yeah. Think about, that's a good illustration. Think about the number of people with whom you shake hands on a Sunday morning. You say, how are you, Brother Thompson? Fine, I'm fine. Has he actually even heard and paid attention to what you're asking? No, that's just a standard response. Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, used to hold an annual day in which the White House was open to all comers, and he would stand and shake hands with everybody that went through the line, the receiving line, and he was famous for being able to shake several hundred hands per hour. And to amuse himself on one of these occasions, as he noticed that people weren't actually paying attention to what he said, he began to shake hands saying, I murdered my mother this morning. I murdered my mother this morning. I murdered my mother this morning. The only person who caught it was the English ambassador, who looked him in the eye and said, I'm sure she deserved it, and moved on. So she gives a non-committal response and is met by the servant Gehazi and will not be deterred, pushes her way past him. She wants to see the man of God. Came to the mountain of the man of God, caught hold of his feet. Gehazi came to push her away, and Elisha says, leave her alone. She's in some bitter distress, and the Lord has not revealed it to me. He's hidden it from me. And now she unburdens her heart. Did I not ask my Lord? Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, don't deceive me? And now Elisha understands, okay, something's happened to the boy. Tie up your garment, Gehazi. Take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, don't speak to them, don't greet them. If anyone greets you, don't respond. You lay my staff on the face of the child And then the mother said, as the Lord lives and as you live yourself, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. Gehazi goes on ahead, lays the staff on the face of the child. Nothing happens. The child is not awakened. Elisha comes in, sees the child, and notice what it says, lying dead. So he's not swooned. He's not in a coma. He's dead. Goes in, shuts the door, the two of them, and prays to the Lord. And then lies on top of the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, face to face, hand to hand, whole thing. And what happens? The child revives. God's answer to the woman's generosity and kindness had been to give her the greatest joy she could experience in life in that time and that culture. Her faith is challenged and tested by what happens. The miracle is a slow working miracle. It doesn't happen just instantaneously, but it does occur. The son is restored. Look at verse 37. She came and fell at Elisha's feet, bowing to the ground, and picked up her son and went out, a grateful, grateful heart. Well, I just looked at the clock and realized that we're a little past time for our break. So let's stop here. We'll deal with the other miracles of Elisha when we come back. Questions, comments, or observations before we break?
If there's any purpose to the slow action of the miracle versus going back and saying, he'll be okay, she goes back, he's alive, versus all this drama. You think about when Christ would heal, was there a purpose, or have you heard of a purpose behind it? When Christ would heal a man, he'd say, I see things like trees, and he goes to him again. I think there's purpose behind that one. I don't, have you heard a purpose behind this one being?
Well, in the case of the man who was born blind and saw first, the two-step miracle, as it were, I see men as trees. That is to say, I see, and I don't have any frame of reference to understand what I'm looking at yet. And so then the rest of the miracle is, okay, now I understand what I'm seeing. In this case, why was this a slow acting miracle? I don't know. I'm sure, like you, I'm confident that there's some reason that it was done this way. What that reason is, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. Other than to speculate, it tests the faith of the woman. And isn't it interesting who has also witnessed to all of these things? Gehazi. And he's going to figure in future events. Well, let's stop here and we'll pick up. It's 7:26. We'll pick up at 7:40.
I love the fact that the husband sent the servant with the dead boy. He didn't do it himself.
Yep. The husband
Amen.
himself. It makes you wonder about the faith and the worship of the husband, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll pause here. Feet no swim. All right. Let's get back to Elisha and see some more of the miracles. So we come into the end of chapter 4 of 2 Kings. Elisha has raised from the dead the son of the Shunammite woman. He comes to Gilgal. All right, think about where we are now. Oh, we got another one coming into class. All right. He comes to Gilgal. So he has come back down here to the plains of the Jordan near Jericho, where the school of the prophets is located, evidently, the vicinity. There's a
Did you turn the recording, David, did you turn the recording back on?
I did.
Okay.
I did. So the sons of the prophets are there, and they're going to put together a meal. What happens? They've gone out and basically gathered up whatever they could find. There's a famine in the land. They're just looking for whatever they can eat. So they found a wild vine, gathered from it in his lap full of wild gourds, put them in the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. Well, that's a dangerous thing to do, isn't it? Eat something, you don't know what it is. One sister I know observed ducks nibbling on the leaves of elephant ears along the creek behind their house years ago, and decided, well, if the ducks are eating it must be safe for me to eat. So she proceeded to cut elephant ears and begin to include them in the salad. And when she tried to eat them, Her mouth went numb. Lips and tongue went numb and stayed that way for hours. And that's when she discovered it may be safe for ducks to eat, but it's not safe for people to eat. But anyway, this is what happens to these guys, these servants of the Lord, sons of the prophets. They make the stew, they pour out to eat, and no, this is poisonous. There's death in the pot. Well, God takes care of his own folks. By miracles and by providence in those days, now by providence and the guidance of his word. So here, bring flour, pour it out, throw it in the pot, pour out some for the men that they may eat, and it neutralizes whatever was poisonous in the pot. Come down to verse 42. 42 to 44, a man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, fresh ears of grain in his sack. Give to the men that they may eat. How can I set this before 100 men? Now, 20 loaves, well, just slice the loaves. Think about the perspective here. Number one, this is a first fruits offering. This is brought to the man of God. This is brought to Elisha. Elisha is going to share it out. Well, a normal portion would likely be considered one of those loaves. And we've got 100 men and only 20 loaves and some ears of grain. Share them out, he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. Thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he said it before them. They ate and had some left according to the word of the Lord. This is a precursor in one way of Jesus feeding the 5,000, feeding the 4,000. When God blesses you, he blesses abundantly, doesn't he? In each case, there are leftovers. There's something to be appreciative for after the fact. Matthew chapter 14, chapter 15, the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, they took up plenty of scraps afterwards. Well, likewise here, there's plenty left over. Come into chapter 5 now, and here we are introduced to Naaman. Naaman is a commander in the army of the king of Syria. Now, where is Syria? Syria lies to the north and slightly east of the territory of Israel. It's above and to the east of the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain range. It is the top, basically, of the Fertile Crescent. And it's interesting at this point, Syria is the dominant power. Militarily, politically, Syria is the dominant power in the ancient world. That's about to change, but at this point, they are still the world-beating power. Syria is going to be absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrian Empire is located just a little bit east of there and going down into the territory of Babylon. But here, Naaman is a high-ranking official in the court and the army of the Syrian king, a mighty man of valor. So his position, his bravery, his effectiveness, his machismo is not even remotely in doubt. He is a great man from a human point of view, but he's a leper. He has the most dreaded disease of the ancient world. What's the most fearsome disease in the world today? We've had coronavirus on our minds and on the front page of the paper and on every newscast for 2 years. And almost 1 million Americans have died with coronavirus, not necessarily from, but with. And how many people, percentage-wise, die of coronavirus? It's less than 1%. Yeah. Of all the people that have had it, less than 1 out of 100, more like 1 out of about 400, actually die with it, not even necessarily from it. But it's the thing that's on everybody's mind and all over the news and everything. What's the most fearsome disease you can think of? Cancer or HIV or AIDS. What else can you think of that's a horrifying disease?
Heart disease.
Heart disease. That's miserable. How about things like hemorrhagic fever, Ebola, things like that? That's terrifying too, isn't it? Leprosy in the ancient world was all of those things rolled into one. Leprosy in the ancient world. Now, leprosy in the modern world is treatable with antibiotics. It's known as Hansen's disease. There are still leper colonies in the modern world, in some parts of the world. In fact, there was a leper colony in Hawaii. I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was a leper colony in Hawaii still in existence and still occupied by some folks suffering from the effects of leprosy at the turn of the 21st century. But leprosy is eminently treatable. You can't reverse it, can't reverse its effects, but it's eminently treatable with antibiotics in the modern world. They didn't have antibiotics in this time. Leprosy untreated in some forms was a death sentence because it is a disease that causes your extremities and parts of your body and parts of your flesh to die, to rot and die. You lose digits, you lose fingers, you lose toes. You may lose parts of your face, your head. Skin will slough off. And of course, when it dies, what does that leave? That leaves a wound for infection, an open portal for infection and inflammation. So it was a horrible, disfiguring disease. And untreated over time, those varieties are fatal. Now we go back to the book of Exodus, book of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all through there, the references to leprosy do make this distinction. Not all forms of leprosy were permanent or fatal. When a Jew, when a Hebrew was determined to be infected with leprosy, what were they to do? They were to go show themselves to the priest, number one, and then quarantine. And then after so many days, the priest is to re-examine it, see if it's the ongoing type or if it's the basically temporary type. And if it heals, make the offerings and boy, be thankful. And if it doesn't heal, get out of town, cover your face, warn off anybody that comes near you, unclean, unclean. And you're basically, you're out of luck. You don't get to be around people anymore except other lepers. That was the case for Israel. There was no such law, at least from God, among the Gentiles. So here is this mighty man of valor afflicted with leprosy. And in one of their raids, they had carried off a little Israelite girl who becomes his wife's servant. She's been enslaved. She is kidnapped and enslaved. Well, without going into the rightness or wrongness of what has happened to her, we might just observe, what had God warned his own people about if they turned away from him? I'm going to do to you the same thing that I did to the people I ran out of the land before you. If you're not faithful to me, this is what's going to happen. Well, all of Israel is not faithful to him for the most part. 7,000, yes, but by and large, they're not faithful. So it's hardly surprising that here is an Israelite girl in servitude. And she remarks to her mistress, oh, it's a pity. It's a pity that my Lord Naaman doesn't know the prophet in Samaria. He could be healed. There's a prophet who could heal him. Well, boy, when you're afflicted with something for which there's no cure, and somebody tells you, oh, guess what? Yeah, there is a cure. What are you liable to do? man, I'll move heaven and earth to get that cure. I'll give my estate. So here comes Naaman to Samaria with a letter from the king of Syria, who is the dominant power. Now, in Samaria, the Israelites oppress the Moabites, and the Jews to the south oppress the Edomites, and they put to tribute those nations around them. But guess who is looming on their border? Big bad Syria. So here comes Naaman with a letter of introduction from the king of Syria, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, pounds of gold, pounds and pounds of gold. That tallies up. A shekel is not quite half an ounce. So you tally up 6,000, roughly 3,000 ounces of gold, or almost 3,000 ounces. That's a lot of gold. And then on top of that, 10 changes of clothing brings the letter to the king of Israel. What am I, Joram, what am I going to do about this? I'm nobody to deal with this. Am I God to kill and make alive? Isn't it interesting to think about this? The king sees this only as a provocation, a probing by the king of Syria. This man is seeking a quarrel with me. This is just an excuse to pick a fight with me. If I can't heal his servant, he's going to go to war with me. Well, Elisha, send him to me. Sent word. Why have you torn your clothes? Why are you upset about this? Send him to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. Joram doesn't seem to even think about Elisha until he receives word from him. After all that he has seen, he still doesn't take God into account. So Naaman comes with his horses and his chariots to Elisha's house, and Elisha doesn't even come out to see him. Gehazi goes out. Here's what the master says: go dip 7 times in the river Jordan, and you'll be cleansed. Huh. That's not at all what Naaman expected. Have you ever bragged about what something cost you? Think about this. Have you ever known someone who would brag about how much something cost? Why would someone do that?
Makes them feel important.
Okay, it makes them feel important.
I'm bragging how cheap I got something.
You know,
Yes.
I'm over on your side of the fence. I brag about how cheap I've gotten something, but well, I paid so much for this. Well, that shows how much I have. That shows how important I am, how much store I set by this. And we all kind of go, Naaman came prepared to pay a king's ransom, basically. Go back and look at what he brought. 10 talents of silver, that's about 75 pounds. 750 pounds of silver. Almost 3,000 ounces of gold. Changes of clothing, and I really don't think it was raggedy old blue jeans. He was prepared to pay a king's ransom almost, expecting to pay, and there's no charge. Go dip 7 times in the river Jordan, and you'll be healed. Your flesh will be restored, and you'll be clean. Now think about the statement by Elisha, your flesh shall be restored. How far had the disease progressed for Naaman? I don't know. It was enough that it was obvious that he was suffering from leprosy. It was enough that he was seeking a cure for it. It wasn't the variety of leprosy that was harmless. He wanted to be cured. Had he lost some flesh? Probably. Had his joints begun to stiffen and decay? Maybe. Had he come to the point that his wife wouldn't want to have anything to do with him because of his appearance or his disease? Maybe.
He's come to the point that the cure is worth this much money, right?
There you go.
When you first get something, it's like a little itch on my face. All of a sudden I have this rash over my head. You know, I
Yeah.
never pay attention to it, but now it becomes this big problem. Like I'll do anything to get rid of it. So at some
Okay.
point he sees this value. So you got to think it's some,
It must have progressed to some degree.
like I'm willing to pay this much.
He is willing to pay this much, expecting to pay this much to get rid of this. Go dip 7 times in the River Jordan and your flesh will be restored. It's not just will stop the disease in its tracks. You will regain what you have lost. And Naaman was angry and went away. Behold, I thought surely he would come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place. What was Naaman's problem here?
Thinking too much.
He's overthinking this. Naaman's problem is that God's will seemed foolish to him. It wasn't what he expected. God wasn't doing things the way he thought God ought to do them. Take your Bible and flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 for a minute. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul is writing to the Christians at Corinth who have just a whole host of problems and issues in the church there. And notice what he says to them in verses 26 and 27, writing to them as Christians to think about who and what they are. Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Go on in verse 28. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human might boast in the presence of God. Jump over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 for just a minute. And notice there in 2 Corinthians 2, as Paul writes to this same group of Christians in verse 19, he says there, verse 17, we are not, like so many, peddlers of God's word, the English Standard Version, but as men of sincerity, as commissioned by God. In the sight of God, we speak in Christ. We don't do it the way everybody else does. Naaman thought that Elisha ought to behave like his prophets and his holy men back in Syria. And he was offended that he didn't. Look at his reasoning. He continues, the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers at home, well, they're better than this stream here in Israel. And he's angry, turned and went away in a rage. Were it not for his servants, he'd have gone home and died as a leper. He came on the word of an unknown girl. He came bearing a gift befitting his status as a high-ranking man, basically as a high-ranking nobleman in the greatest empire of the world at that time. The king of Syria, who gave him the letter of introduction, assumed that the king of Israel had as much control over his prophets as the Syrian king has over his. Joram doesn't understand the situation. Elisha does, summons Naaman, prescribes the solution, and does it in a way that there will be no mistaking about the source of it. It's not Elisha's power. Elisha doesn't even show himself. And here we get into pride of office and pride of person. I'm somebody special. I ought to be tended to personally. And his servants came near to him. It's a great word that this prophet has spoken.
You know, it also shows that Naaman wasn't at a point where his servants couldn't just speak to him. You know, sometimes you'd be so high up that somebody's trying to speak to you and tell you what you should do, and you just don't listen. But he was still able to take that in.
Well, that's point well taken. He was not to the point that his servants were terrified to even speak to him, or if they were, that's not recorded. You think about Nathan going to King David, "Thou art the man." Well, don't you know that his heart was in his throat and pounding at about 400 beats a minute when he said that? Because David could have cut him off right there, but he didn't. It's a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? Is that really what he said? A wise servant here. Great results don't necessarily take great deeds to accomplish them. Turn over to John chapter 1 for just a moment. John chapter 1, we meet a man, an associate of Jesus, an apostle. And as far as we know, now we can reasonably deduce this is not the case. But here in John chapter 1 and verse 40, we're introduced to Andrew, one of the two who heard John, that's John the prophet, John the baptizer, one of the two who heard John speak, followed Jesus. And this was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And look at verse 41. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah." And he brought him to Jesus. Andrew is among the apostles. Andrew is among those sent out to evangelize the house of Judah. We might reasonably assume that Andrew taught and baptized many, many, many people in the course of his life. But the only disciple we have a record of him making is right here. As far as we can see, he converted one person basically. But my goodness, look at who it was. Simon Peter. And the whole first half of Acts basically zeroes in to a large degree on the activities of Peter, along with the 11. Great results don't necessarily require extraordinary deeds to accomplish them. This man came seeking an extraordinary result. I want to be healed of something for which there is no cure but God. And I'm willing to pay this extraordinary amount. Why, you know, from a human point of view, Elisha and his descendants from now on would be set for life. He'd be the maybe the second richest man in the kingdom next to the king if he accepted Naaman's offering of payment. And this servant basically says, what do you got to lose? It's not going to cost you anything to try. And think about this as well. He's come down here into Israel from Syria. What's he going to have to do to get home? Unless he wants to go miles out of his way, way up into the mountains to get home, he's going to have to cross the Jordan River anyway. The servant basically saying, look, you got to cross the river. What do you have to lose? Might as well try it. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word that the man of God spoke. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. 7, perfect number, symbol of completeness, perfection, totality. Obedience was required. No obedience, no blessing. He dipped 7 times. That's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It's translated in the Septuagint version as baptizato. He submerged, he immersed himself. Same word that's used in the New Testament to describe baptism. And he became like a little child. Now, that's not a 4-year-old. It's the image of a young man. His flesh is restored. His health, his vitality is back. Isn't it interesting? Naaman holds to the idea that you have to be present where the God resides, or take dirt from his territory with you to be able to honor him. Gather up some of this dirt. He returns to the man of God, comes back to Elisha's house. I'm ready to pay. I'm healed. This is great. As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. I don't want anything from you. I didn't do anything for you. I don't get any credit for this. Why should you pay me for what God has done? Is basically what Elisha's attitude is. And so come down here to verse 18. Here's an interesting response by this heathen worshiping individual, as far as he's been to this point. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. In other words, he says, I know that when I get home, I'm going to have to participate in worship of Rimmon, just like I always have, because that's what the king will require, and I have to be there for him. And he asks God's pardon for any sin that he might incur in participating in that. And Elisha can do nothing but send him on in peace. That's between you and God. If your heart is set on the Lord to do his will, that's between you and God. You're not part of the house of Israel. So, what I would tell you as a Jew, that doesn't apply to you, or as a Hebrew, that doesn't apply to you. That's between you and God. Well, I'm going to take a present of earth. I'm going to take 2 mules worth of soil with me. And this whole exchange, you don't owe me anything. I didn't do anything for you. That's just too much for Gehazi. All that money, those fine clothes. And he didn't take a thing. What's wrong with my master? Why wouldn't he accept anything? That guy's not even a fellow Hebrew. My master has spared this Naaman the Syrian in not accepting from his hand what he brought. He was willing to pay for it anyway. I'll run after him and get something from him. Notice what takes place here. Personal success was in sight, he thought. And that concept of success, wealth, prosperity, such a terrible temptation, and such a ridiculous measure of worth. So verses 22, 23, 24, he chases Naaman down. And Naaman's excited to see him. And what does he do? Spins a lie. Well, we've got two young men of the sons of the prophets who've come from Ephraim. And my master doesn't want anything, but could you spare a change of clothes for them? And a talent of silver, a little income for them. Could you bless them? Not for my master, for them. Of course, these guys are what? They're imaginary. They don't exist. He concocts a lie. Let's think about this for a minute. Lying in order to defraud, deceiving to defraud, and then he comes back. Gehazi, where you been? Oh, I didn't go anywhere. Wrong answer. Lie. Did you go accept money and garments from this man? Did you try to better yourself? Were you anticipating prosperity and servants of your own and so forth? Here's your payment. You get Naaman's leprosy. What happened to the changes of clothing and the silver? I don't know. He may have been a wealthy leper. Fat lot of good it does him. He's a leper. Sin has its punishments. Many times right here in this life. Not to mention what comes next. Always in the next life. Well, that brings us down here to war with Ben-Hadad and the deliverance of Samaria. Now, at the beginning of chapter 6, we have the issue of the floating axe head. They're out working. They need more room. Elisha agrees to go with them. They borrow one of the brothers, one of the servants here, borrows, literally begs the lending of an axe head, an axe, and the head comes off. It's lost in the water. Terrible thing to lose anything when you're poor, isn't it? When you can't afford your own and then you have to borrow something, you lose that. Well, who's that on? That's on you to make it good. Go back to Exodus chapter 3, chapter 11, chapter 12. You borrow something, you lose it, you destroy it. You're supposed to make it good. And not just make it good, but there's a penalty attached to that as well. For these guys, this is a catastrophe. Well, show me where it fell. And he showed him the place. Elisha cuts a stick and threw it in the water, made the iron to float. Pick it up. He reached out his hand and took it. What's the purpose of this? Why is this little vignette recorded here? What purpose does it serve?
Well, these guys were prophets. They were sitting at Elisha's feet, basically, being his disciple, and they're trying to build a place for them to all live together. He says, the place we're with you is too small.
Yeah.
And one note I have, it says that there were places at Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho for the prophets to meet.
Yeah.
So these were kind of like preaching students. And
Okay.
maybe this was a faith building thing for them.
Okay. The sons of the prophets, remember what a prophet does. We hear that word prophet, and we've often pointed out, we think of it in the 20th and 21st century context of the culture around us. A prophet does what? Prophet predicts what's going to happen, predicts the future. That does happen with biblical prophets, roughly 4% of the time. about 95, 96% of everything they say is not new revelation. It's not predicting some future event. It's what? It's what we would describe as preaching. It's reiterating, reinforcing, repeating the message that God has already revealed. And that's what these guys do. Wonder what tribe they were from. Any thoughts?
Maybe they were from many tribes. Maybe they were from.
They might be from many of the tribes. They might be from Judah. I would, and this is purely speculation on my part, and I want to advertise it as such, but think about this for a minute. Who would be the natural choice for the sons of the prophets? Which tribe? Levi. Levi is the tribe of priests, but not all Levites are priests, only the priestly families. What do the rest of the Levites do, or what are they supposed to do at any rate? They're supposed to be the teachers, the instructors, the preachers in Israel. That would be a natural choice. I don't know if they were or they weren't. But these guys are, for all practical purposes, we might call them preachers in training. And so they've set about to enlarge their facilities, come into this awkward situation. What are we going to do about it? Elisha effectively rescues the circumstance. Ought they to have increased faith in God? I think so. But now we come down to dealing with the Syrians. Now the Syrians are coming to deal with Israel. Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants. At such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware that you do not pass this place. The Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. All right. What's going on? The Syrians are gunning to oppress, to conquer perhaps Israel. Joram is being warned and is able to dodge their plans. My camp will be here, the king of Syria says. This is where I'm going to raid and to plunder. He's not going to set up a siege. He's going into this area to raid and plunder. All right. Elisha warns Joram. What's Joram going to do? Well, number one, he's going to keep his army out of the way. But number two, if he has forewarning, this is the area where the Syrian king is coming. Well, what are they going to do if they have time? They're going to evacuate all the livestock and haul out all the grain and the stuff that the Syrians would plunder. They're winning even without going to battle. And when they do go to battle, they're winning there. So look at verse 11, the Syrian king, there's got to be a traitor amongst us. This is the only explanation. How can they know where we're going to be? There must be a traitor here. He called his servants, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? Basically, he's threatening his counselors, you better fess up or else. Well, it's not us. He's got a prophet that knows everything. Elisha, the prophet in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. All right. Well, let's get this Elisha. All right. Send out the army. Let's go get him. He's in Dothan. He sent their horses and chariots, a great army, came by night, unusual in that day, and surrounded Dothan. Well, that looks like curtains for Elisha, but no. There's an army all around the servant. This is not Gehazi, apparently. New servant. What shall we do? Don't worry about this. Elisha's response mirrors what ours should be. Don't worry about this. God plus one is a majority. God is always a majority and God is always victorious. My goodness, are we nearly out of time already? We go 6 to 8:30, don't we? My goodness, I had no idea. Well, let's take care of the Syrian army anyway. So Elisha prays, Lord, open his eyes that he may see. The mountain is full of chariots and horses of chariots of fire, horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. That is, God is on his side. The presence of God is there. The Syrians came down. Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike this people blind, please. He struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. Elisha said to them, this is not the way, this is not the city. Follow me and I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. And led them to Samaria. Now let's look at this a minute. Where's Dothan?
Between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea.
Okay,
Just as it used
Dothan is right here.
Jordan.
Dothan is about, it's up in the mountains, about 12, 14 miles east of the Sea of Galilee. Samaria, Shechem as it used to be, down here between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, it's about 10 miles, roughly 12 miles from Dothan to Shechem. So they've got a little ways to go. And Elisha leads them to the capital, right to the king. God struck them with blindness. How does this happen? Did he literally blind them where they could not see? Was it mental blindness, just nothing physical, but just all in their minds? Were their eyes physically affected? I don't know, and I don't care. God could do it however he pleased. Elisha takes them from the mountains of Dothan right into the heart to the capital of Israel. And look at the reception they get. As soon as they entered Samaria, oh Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. The Lord opened their eyes. They saw, behold, they're in the midst of Samaria. They're right in the capital. They're surrounded, as it were. And the king of Israel, what, shall we strike them down? No, 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 no. He's eager in verse 21 for a physical victory. Shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down? It'd be a slaughter, wouldn't it? But look at verses 22 and 23. Killing them would not have helped the situation. Syria would only have a minor defeat, basically. They would continue to attack. They would be seeking vengeance. God has a message for them. He wants Syria to understand. He wants the king of Syria to understand that he has no power against God's people unless God allows it. So what do? Sit them down, feed them dinner, send them home. Think about the impact of this, the impression that this makes, or should make. They had them in the palm of their hand and they didn't even bother to kill them. They just fed them and said, what kind of a king does that? What kind of a God enables him to do that? Well, Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, for the moment, they don't bother Israel. How long does the moment last? I don't know, but apparently not too awfully long. Because before long, here comes Ben-Hadad to besiege Samaria. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. Questions or comments or thoughts?
Looks like the relationship between the king of Israel, Joram, and Elisha changed some from the time when, before they were going to war against Edom. Elisha said, I don't have, I'm not even gonna speak to you. I
Yeah.
wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat, and then over here, when the Syrians are after them, and he captures the Syrians who had prayed to be blinded, the king says to him, at least New King James says, he says to Elisha, my father,
Yep,
shall I kill them?
yep,
Now he's seeking his counsel, and Elisha gives it.
yep.
That's,
So that's an interesting point. It seems that after the matter of the coalition army against the Moabites, where Elisha has said, I wouldn't even bother to speak to you if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat being here. I don't know if things really warmed up very much between Joram and Elisha, but certainly Jehoram seems to be more respectful than he had been. My father, shall we strike them down? And that figure, my father, that's a term of respect, an expression of some degree of reverence toward him. He's asking instructions, should I do this or not? Instead of just taking the initiative and saying, I'm the king, I'm gonna do what I want. So it's point well taken. And how warm were their relations? They weren't exactly chummy.
So after seeing all those miracles that Elijah was doing, I mean, you gotta use common sense to know that they gotta be coming from God.
Cherie's observation is after seeing all the miracles that Elisha has done, after knowing of them, even if he didn't see them, Joram at least has to use common sense to know that God is on his side. Of course, we might also make the observation, sense is never common. That's an oxymoron. But if sense were common, it'd be a different world, wouldn't it? But anyway,
You know,
go ahead, Benji.
chapter 2, when you make the comment about Elisha asking for the double portion of the spirit,
Yes.
and that's relating to the portion of the firstborn. But then when you get to verse 12, Elisha saw it and he cried, my father, my father. And it's like when you put that together, he's viewing him that way, respectful, and maybe even in terms of a father. I know Joram says the same thing, my father, but it sort of fits when you're talking about portion of the firstborn, that then he refers to Elijah as my father.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's in chapter 2 when Elisha inherits the position of the prophet and Elijah is taken up. He uses basically the same term, my father, for Elijah. So, well, he's deserving of it here himself at that point. Other thoughts, other comments?
boys, but a lot of people nowadays seem to me to be like Naaman when it comes to obedience. They want to look for something, or even in worship, something that to our minds is greater than the things that are required are really only simple things.
Yep. Jim makes the point that a whole lot of folks in our world today seem to have Naaman's attitude when it comes to relationship with God, when it comes to the way we worship. We want something spectacular. We want something extraordinary. We want an extravaganza, even when what God wants is really simple. And that leads me to a corollary thought. How many people in our world, especially in the first world, in the Western culture, seem to be intent on having a relationship with God on their terms instead of his. And he's never offered that to anyone. It's always come to him on his terms. Anybody else? Online folks? Well, if not, then we'll stop here and we'll pick up at this point next week. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good,
Yeah. Thank you for the class.
good lesson.